There was a wall outside, parallel to the chambers towards the outer court, opposite the chambers, 50 cubits long. For the chambers on the outer court were 50 cubits long, while those opposite the temple were 100 cubits long. At the foot of these chambers ran a passage that one entered from the east in order to enter them from the outer court. The width of this passage is fixed by the wall of the court. On the south, also, opposite the vacant area and opposite the building, there were chambers with a passage in front of them. They were similar to the chambers on the north, of the same length and width, with the same exits and arrangements and doors. So the entrances of the chambers to the south were entered through the entrance at the head of the corresponding passage from the east, along the matching wall. Then the Lord said to me, "The north chambers and the south chambers opposite the vacant area are holy chambers, where the priests who approach the Lord shall eat the most holy offerings. There they shall deposit the most holy offerings, the grain offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering, for the place is holy. When the priests enter the holy place, they shall not go out of it to the outer court without laying the vestments in which they minister, for these are holy. These are holy. They shall put on other garments before they go near to the area open to the people. They shall put on other garments before they go near to the area open to the people." When he had finished measuring the interior of the temple area, he led me out by the gate that faces east and measured the temple all around. He measured the east side with the measuring reed, 500 cubits by the measuring reed. Then he turned and measured the north side, 500 cubits by the measuring reed. Then he turned and measured the south side, 500 cubits by the measuring reed. Then he turned to the west and measured 500 cubits by the measuring reed. He measured it on the four sides. It had a wall around it, 500 cubits long and 500 cubits wide, to make a separation between the holy and the common. Ezekiel 42, verses 7 through 20. 13 days ago, I made the decision to make the 9-hour drive back to Alabama in the middle of a pandemic because I didn't want to risk being separated from my family in the midst of a nationwide shutdown. I only got out of my car twice during that drive, and I strategically chose those spots based off of outbreak maps that I found on the internet. I sprayed my shoes with alcohol before I got back in the car. I barely breathed when I was outside. And on that drive, I had 3 panic attacks. Just thinking of the possibility of being asymptomatic and possibly bringing this virus into my house where my 2 siblings with complex medical conditions were. I knew I would be quarantined from them. I knew that the possibility was so small, but the panic was almost crippling. And when I got home, it was all I could do just to get to my bed and collapse. I broke down in tears, and I knew that my family couldn't even come and touch me to make me feel better. My dad put on a rain jacket. He stuffed his arms and his hands into the sleeves, and he wrapped the hood around his face, and he came and hugged me. And that is the closest thing that I have gotten to physical touch in 22 days. Everything that I'm doing right now is meticulously measured. I have to carry around a bottle of Lysol. For the last 13 days, I've sprayed everything that I've touched or even breathed on. My things have sat in my car for a week, so I didn't have to clean each individual item and waste valuable cleaning supplies that seems to disappear from the grocery store shelves every day. Taking a shower, brushing my teeth, it's like a surgical procedure. Disinfecting before and after. Everything that I do is perfectly measured. And it's miserable. It's completely miserable. It's also so worth it. Every moment of anxiety, every measurement that I make, every moment that I take to disinfect or clean or spray with Lysol or measure the 6 feet in between, every moment of loneliness or starvation for physical touch, it is worth it because of those 2 babies inside and every other vulnerable member of our population. Every vulnerable person who needs to be protected right now. They are worth our effort. My siblings are the most precious thing in the world to me. They have taught me more about God than any other people. I've mentioned them in almost every sermon that I've ever given, and I will measure everything that I do if that's what it takes to keep them safe. That's what I'll do. I share all of this against some really good preaching advice. Not to bleed all over your congregation and not to assume that everyone's experiences are the same. I share this because right now I think we would be kidding ourselves if we didn't acknowledge that everyone is bleeding right now. Some of us are bleeding more than others. Some of us can do a pretty good job of patching ourselves up. Some of us have to rely on others to patch us up. Some of us are triaging. And so I share. I share how I'm bleeding. And I use a universal we because in this unique moment in our history, we really are all in this together. We are all in this together. We are all measuring. We're all measuring our lives so carefully. We are measuring every move, every breath, every roll of toilet paper, every can of Lysol, every foot of physical distance. We are measuring every penny, every case, every N95 mask, every ventilator, every hospital bed, every death. Every day on this curve, we are measuring. We're measuring together. But I think that as we're measuring, we're also worshiping. We are building a temple together. I've spent the last 3 months with the prophet Ezekiel in one of my classes. He is famous for his bizarre visions and his dry bones and his wheels within the wheels. I've read commentaries that have called him everything from a visionary to a schizophrenic. But after spending probably 3 months obsessively focusing on this prophet, I think that the most important realization that I've come to is also the simplest. Ezekiel was a man. Ezekiel was a priest and a prophet He was a man with a calling on his life, much like many of us. He was a man who heard God speak and tried to share God's words as best he could, just like many of us do. And when Ezekiel was about the same age I was, he experienced a traumatic life event with his community. Ezekiel and his community, they were invaded by the Babylonians and sent into exile. From what we know about exile, captivity, we know that Ezekiel and his community were probably victims of violence. Ezekiel watched communities being torn apart, families being torn apart. He was taken from his home, separated from his friends and family. Everything that he knew. And perhaps most significantly to Ezekiel, Ezekiel was separated from the temple, from his place of worship. It may sound silly to say that Ezekiel would mourn the loss of the temple more than home or loved ones, but Ezekiel was a priest who worshiped God. Losing the temple meant that he lost his purpose. Losing the temple meant that he couldn't lead his community in worship according to the laws set forth in the Torah. It meant that he couldn't offer sacrifices for himself or his community, something mandated by the law according to God, so that they would be pure in God's eyes. He lost the ability to lead worship. In essence, Ezekiel lost the foundation of his connection to God. And frankly, this feels really familiar to me right now. I'm a seminary student, and I can't sit in my classes with my colleagues and my professors. I can't go to the library. I've lost a lot of my focus. I am a church intern, and I am 3 states away from my congregation. I am someone discerning a call to teach, and I have lost the opportunity to discern that call in my international field ed placement, where I would be teaching in a seminary this summer. I'm a preacher. That's the calling that is most clear to me. And I stared at a blank Word document for days before I could get a sermon out of myself. I'm sharing this sermon almost a week later than I had planned, because right now I'm moving through a spiritual fog. Everything that I know about God during my faith journey, the most important thing to me has always been the Incarnation. The fact that God chose to be physically present with us, with his body, that he got close, that he touched us. Jesus wasn't afraid of the leper. He touched him with his hands. Jesus didn't adhere to the purity rules. He used his hands to raise dead bodies to life. The most radical thing about God is that he left heaven, became a body, and was born through a womb, birthed in a dirty stable, held by a mother, kissed by friends and family, beaten and killed by enemies, and then raised back to life in his body to walk and talk and share a meal with his friends and loved ones after he was raised. My faith is built on this embodied God who got close and who touched us. How do I make sense of that God when touch is gone? How do we worship as a community when we are exiled from each other? How do we be the church and worship together when we have to measure the walls between each other? How can I love my neighbor when I can't touch them? But then I remember a part of the story that I forgot. I remember the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. I remember that God was meeting with us, drawing close to us, worshiping with us, meeting us in worship long before Jesus ever walked the earth. For the ancient Israelites, it looked different. They had their tabernacle in the desert. They had visions in the exile. Their tabernacle, their temples were perfectly measured. They had to set strict boundaries to protect that which was most precious and most holy. I don't know exactly why worship had to look different during that time. What I do know is that none of these iterations of worship or meeting spaces with God were any less valid. What I know is that God wasn't any less present then or now. Throughout our history, God has been meeting with us in communion across and even through boundaries. God walked in the garden with Adam and Eve. God wrestled with Jacob by the Jabbok. God inhabited a tiny room, the Ark of the Covenant, in the middle of the tabernacle and the temple, perfectly measured. God spent 9 months in the cramped isolation of Mary's womb. God has inhabited grand cathedrals and underground churches. God has inhabited universities, concentration camps, libraries, college dorms, prison cells, wide open fields. And right now, this embodied God is inhabiting our live streamed and pre-recorded worship services, because right now, the best way that we can follow the example of the Incarnation is by protecting each other's bodies through our distance. And through that, we are worshiping. We are still worshiping. We are offering up our hosannas. Even as we weep with Jesus over the city, we are offering up our walls and our distance and our careful measurements as love offerings to God. Because we know that God is present. God is close to us. God is touching us, even when we can't touch each other. Thanks be to God. Amen.